to do a little visual. See if you can see the dragon. Where am I looking?
To your
there.
So this is the window that you want it to be in. So it's not. I mean, you can do it that way.
We're overhead. I see where
do
we're
it that
at.
way and hold it up, or that there you go. Right there is much better.
That angle's a little bit difficult to reach, but I can do it.
Well, I can slide
Well,
it closer to you.
I was just thinking.
But you can also just hold it up in front of you as well. If you just
Sure.
hold it in front of you like that, that actually works pretty well.
Oh, I see.
So.
So how long have you had this set up down here in this particular configuration?
Well, I keep tweaking it every week, but about a month.
I think somewhere
So last month.
in the dark recesses, I might have one from 1973 lying around my mom and dad's house.
As a teacher, I understand dark recesses. They're usually the indoor type.
I thought maybe if we donated that as
this is gorgeous.
Yeah.
as a possible object.
Yeah.
This
Nice.
one I was not so.
1999.
Excellent.
Rocking it
It's
like
in
the
good shape
1990s.
too.
I
Mine
know.
are pretty beat up.
The only problem I had is I don't know if this is an
Nice.
official Galadriel
Oh.
statue or not. The person who gave it to me said he painted it from a set, so I'm not sure. You know, it's kind of a
Paint by room.
paint by rune. Yeah. I don't know.
It's a pity. I think you ruined it. What do you think?
Oh boy.
Sorry.
This is what you get when
Yeah,
you
I
hang
know.
around with the nerds.
Yeah. I'm gone for 2 months and I have to store up all of them. If that can be.
He's
said.
throwing out all these really good jokes. No, I'm just
Well,
kidding.
not good. But I am wearing my Patrick Stay shirt, so I should
Very cool.
undo the flannel.
Since my
Yes.
yeah. So did you get to see the Gandalf there?
I did.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Very cool.
A friend of mine, he was wood. He liked to do wood burnings, and so that I believe is a wood burning there.
Excellent.
What's in that?
I'm just making sure that the numbers
whatever
are all
you want.
matching up because it should be 21 when you add them together, right? I think 20 and 1.
No.
When you look at the opposite numbers, usually
I don't know.
10,
I didn't know
11.
that
Yeah,
was
it is.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Sure, because when you look at a 6-sided die, they all add up to the same numbers,
Okay.
and they do that I think on D8 and D20 as well.
What's inside that?
If I showed you, it'd kill you. Haven't you ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark?
I don't think he's really carrying a grail in there anywhere.
Drake,
Or
Ooh,
Kingdom
how are you?
of the Crystal
good to see you.
Skull.
The crystal skull was, I don't know.
really kind of buried by things, but you know, as long as you come up for air, it's okay,
It
right?
feels like there was too much
They
urban
just
legend
did Bye Bye Birdie
and
for the
what I'm going to
that's
call
play.
genre.
So
I watched
Genre
Area
go lay down in
51.
the
Right,
room
right.
and
The instant you
yes.
bring
That
Area
was
51 into it,
Yeah.
and it's the 60s,
So yeah,
and the Russians
Mercy,
running around.
Mercy's
It
senior
just
year,
feels
so
like
she
it was
in
too. It
Irene,
was too bland. I mean,
was also
it was
they
too.
did swing
It
dancing,
wasn't very
so
unique.
they enjoyed that.
It was a very.
It's their thing.
If you want some well done stuff,
They're like, Dad, you need to
You
learn how to do this
actually need
because
to get to
if
the
we ever
TV
get married,
series,
we are
which
doing
is
swing dancing. So
Hello.
learn now.
breaking into when
Yep. No,
he was
please
a boy.
do.
Oh yes, I did
I
see
know.
that when
That's-
it was on. Mom
that
thought
was
that was
wonderful.
fascinating
But
it's too
because he was
vigorous.
going from
Hey, I
different
got this
countries.
text from this guy named Brian Gooseland. I'm not sure who he is.
Yeah,
He said it was the meeting was going to be here this week.
yeah. I don't know who he is.
Well,
I've heard that
Yeah.
those are spam texts. You really
Feel free
should ignore
to
them.
Well,
slide
maybe
over
I
the
wish I
chair.
had one last month.
Pull up that leather-bound.
land,
I didn't realize it was.
land that is
Oh.
in
Get
the
in-
public
get in cozy
domain.
there, Brian, Chris,
Whose
and
land?
Corey.
It is.
Slide over to your right a
Land.
little bit.
Land. Oh.
Make room for
Lands
Richard.
that is in the public domain.
If only my initials were BLM, right?
BLM?
You could
Bureau of
probably
Land Management.
pull one of those stools around and slide over.
Well, he's got a chair here.
What do you think I am?
Bureau of Land Management.
These are hefty stools.
I kept borrowing
Ooh.
Hawk's version of the
And they
Hawk's,
rotate too.
Hawk's Silmarillion, so I brought my own.
Hughes
Corey doesn't like
Aircraft.
me either.
Yeah, that's
Company.
true. That's true. Ooh, that goes way
Yeah.
back.
Emails.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Did you send me an email?
The
I sent you a
official
text.
Oh,
airline. Of
you're
the
poking me all the
1974
time.
Spokane.
For the first week, maybe.
Well, you need to find out what
I
land
poked you
owned
once. You
and,
never replied, so I didn't bother to poke
claim
you.
it. Use
I know exactly. It's in Norway. I've been on the family farm, but it got sold out from under us 100 years ago. It's kind of hard to, the statute of limitations and all
Yeah,
that.
that should make it a little
100
easier.
years ago.
You have a family farm in Norway that got sold out from underneath you?
Well, not quite. Actually, it
Wasn't that
went to
before
the
you were
oldest son. What's that?
Wasn't that before you were born?
Maybe. If I told you, I'd have to kill you.
So would that
Yeah.
be Hughes and son?
Sorry, this just reminded me of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, where Selena, who's the little boy, and he's basically the homunculus of pride, but he's been like 8 years old.
Which version are we talking about?
Brotherhood.
I haven't seen it, so
They've made a new live action movie that.
No, not that one.
No.
The one before that. It's the most recent animated one. Because there's the main two different ones in animated.
I've watched all of them except
Yeah.
for the movie.
It's the one where Hughes, you were talking about Hughes,
Oh.
Lieutenant Hughes dies.
Yeah, Pride was the
Oh,
child.
yeah.
It's that
That's
case.
Yeah, so Child Pride was a child, and he was like decades before they found photos where he's still 8 years old. So I was saying maybe I'm like 100 years old. Maybe I'm homunculus.
I think you'd have more hair.
Oh! Come closer so I can hit you with my bone.
It's like we're all good to go.
I'll lodge it in between your throat.
You need to stay away
Whoops,
from the
Marie.
coffee. You really did.
Actually, it's just the smell that activates it.
Brian, hold out your
I've
hand.
never seen you so animated. What in the world? Are the kids?
Yes!
Are the kids in your class
I'm
all
alive!
getting A's or something?
You're gonna have to rein us in here.
Yes, so it is now time. We are live. We are streaming. We have audio.
I don't
Now
trust
we
his
have-
laptop.
You
It
guys,
says
you'll
Dell.
see a delay there.
Now we have a
But the
primary
reason why you have that, you can see if somebody posts a question
now we have a
in the
primary
chat
record of,
on our YouTube
Brian's
channel.
addiction to-
But there's a delay. There's a delay. It'll be like 30 to 90 seconds delay.
Yeah, look.
I love it in Independence Day. Let's record this. That way we know when we screw up.
There you go. Cut quick.
So, Maya Govanen, hail and well met. Welcome to the Tolkien Society monthly meeting and broadcast. We are an official smile of the UK Tolkien Society. I'm Hawk Robinson, founder of the organization, and we have
Brian Hewsland, secretary of said organization.
Chris Cooperstein, member.
Corey Newkirk. Not official member, but
well, you're a member. We have
Member
no
of this.
dues.
I just renewed my membership.
Yeah.
Richard Baldwin wandering homeless.
And so if you want to know which
Forgot
camera to
to-
look at, the camera is not at the TV. That's the camera that you guys are on. So if you want to look at a camera, that's the camera. to
I
look at.
thought homeless was synonymous with a-
So, what?
Yes, it is. That would be redundant, wouldn't it?
Are you repeating yourself? Or you're saying the same thing over and over?
Isn't that why
It's a
Brian's
continuing
school teacher?
tautology. What's that?
Isn't that why Brian's a school teacher?
Absolutely.
Redundancy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, so last month we both Brian and I were out of town for various reasons, and fortunately Chris
still
was
showed
kind
up.
enough. Yes, I'm sorry you didn't get the message. You didn't get the memo.
How much did you guys pay him to entertain me at his house? How much was that? I just
What?
pay you back or anything?
What?
I was the only one that
Maybe.
showed up.
Nobody gets paid. Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah, because he can make it. Well,
No, if you
I
show
don't
up
know,
the
but-
wrong place,
but
we deduct
I'm
it
glad,
from
Chris.
your,
Thank you for
salary.
stepping up and trying to make that happen.
Sure.
At some point here, maybe I should give both you and Brian the logins for the Twitter and other accounts so that you can spread the word when
At
there's
some
changes
point.
like that. Would you like me to do that today after the broadcast?
Oh, I'd like the taste of ultimate power, yes.
He sure is
We're talking about
today.
handing in the one ring. Is that what we're doing?
You've been getting sleep, haven't you?
It's the sound of relief.
So,
Oh, too much to-
Chris, was it Chris who kept the notes for the
Overdose.
meeting?
Yes.
And then
they
relayed
were
them to
far too
Brian and-
verbose.
Oh, I think they were great. And Brian kindly forwarded them to me, and they're on the website. So our website is tolkienscholars.org. Our YouTube channel, where we're streaming live, is youtube.com/Tolkien Scholars. And as I said, we meet every month, the third Saturday of each month, from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific time. You can tweet us on Twitter at Tolkien Scholars, and we're on Google Plus, and technically we're on Facebook, but we don't really use Facebook. It's just more hassle than it's worth. And because every time we start to get 1,000, 2,000 followers, Facebook kills the account or changes it again, and we'll lose everybody. And like after the third time of that happening, I just went, I give up. I just screw Facebook. I don't care. So Google Plus doesn't do that to us. Twitter doesn't do that to us, and of course our website doesn't do that to us. YouTube's doing its own shenanigans, but we haven't tried to raise money or anything, so it doesn't really affect us. So, Brian, you're the Smile secretary. Would you be so kind as to run us through last month's notes to bring everybody up to speed, please? And happy St. Patty's Day, by the way.
Yes.
Also, happy birthday, Brennan, my middle son. Hello, welcome.
Hi.
Hello, I'm so glad you could make it.
Do we want to move one of these stools?
Well,
over?
no, they can. I've got a camera pointing that way too, so go ahead and you can sit on the couch here. Let me just move stuff.
Whoa, I see you. I know nothing.
We have cameras in all sorts of directions here, so we are streaming.
He's able to be in two places at once.
That's fancy.
Really fancy.
So make yourselves comfortable.
We brought a friend.
Welcome.
In
You
Twain.
are.
My name's Andre.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Hawk Robinson, founder here. We'll go through the intros again. We have Brian, who's the secretary.
Hi, Andre.
Chris, who's an official member. UK Tolkien Society as well.
Okay.
Corey. Richard. And then for the guests at home, introduce yourselves as well.
My name's Wesley.
I'm Stephanie.
So welcome, welcome. And let me make sure I get this camera at you guys okay here. Let's see.
Interesting setup here today.
So we're getting ready to launch a new weekly show, role-playing gaming show for a fundraiser for RPG research, and so we've been getting this all set up for that.
Whoa.
And so because all my broadcast equipment's down here, everything's a mess because I unloaded the trailer. Everything's just there's so much going on. It's so busy. But I was like, okay, how can I minimally mess with my setup for the show and still cover this? So this will do for now. I need to get a camera back here for audience, but that should work. You guys, it should pick you up. Go ahead and speak. Let's see how it does.
Okay.
Oh yeah, yeah, that seems to work fine. Let me see if this one.
I've never heard a more profound statement in my life.
Try that again.
The intonation itself,
Yeah.
the repetition.
Doing okay. And I'm going to listen to it on here for just a sec.
You don't happen to have a spare power cord somewhere nearby underneath you?
Go ahead and blah 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 again.
Only a 24 ounce? Is that what that is?
You know, if you lean me close, I can
Perhaps.
apply you.
Oh, you have notes.
Lean that
Oh, you
far.
don't.
I'm just looking at your coffee.
Yeah, you were looking
It's a
so
little,
them
a little quiet, but you can be heard, so just speak up a little bit.
There is a little bit of light coming.
You
It looks
picked the
kind
wrong
of
one.
bright over.
Do you have an
Wesley's
extension
head.
cord you could just
Oh, I
hook me
mean,
into?
Not Wesley.
Yes, just a
Sorry.
minute.
Yeah,
Just a
close
halo?
enough.
It's just his halo.
Yeah.
Try it that way.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. The power's clear down here, though.
You don't have anything.
Uh,
Well, I've got 7%. Maybe
well,
I'll
let me
make
tell you what. I can put it up on the
Oh,
table,
yeah,
and then
we're
it'll
gonna
be.
have a
just
conversation.
temporarily
Well, we just
Yeah.
until I finish reading the notes.
yeah, just talk. We'll talk into that one, and it'll
Yes, sir.
Oh, Brian's also known as the Bureau of Land Management.
No. It's the Bureau of Myth Management.
Oh, sure, it's not the Bureau of Mismanagement.
Myth?
Little myth marker.
Yeah.
The whole Robert Lynn Asprin series, the Myth series.
Yeah.
Any of you ever read those? Okay. 70s and 80s. Robert Lynn Asprin was an author and editor for many fantasy book series in the 70s and 80s and such. And I think he was married to...
Another author, wasn't it?
Yeah, another author for many years. I'm trying to remember her name.
I can't.
Because
Just
she
wasn't done in
rebooted
those
the
days.
Thieves World series later in the early 2000s that he had originally started. All right, so keep your eyes open for. So if you would like to comment, I will try to keep an eye in the irc.Tolkien Gateway and irc.merp.com channels. We also now have a Discord chat channel just to add more fun.
What is this Discord?
Discord is the latest incarnation of instant chat. So if you go to discordapp.com, it lets you do chat. It can also do audio and such, but main thing is text chat like Internet Relay Chat, IRC. And it can either be through your web browser or you can download and install the app. The app will work on your phone. It'll work on your laptop, desktop, what have you. It's cross-platform, Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, iPhone. And but it just lets you have a means of interacting with us through chat. So that's the latest edition. If you go to TolkienScholars.org, go to our website there, and you should find a link to join our Discord chat. But I'm still supporting IRC. And, of course, if you go to our youtube.com/Tolkien Scholars site, and you have a YouTube Google account, you can comment right there. We have this stream up on the big screen here so that at least some can see. Maybe I'll rotate a little bit so you guys can see it better. I don't expect a lot of chat activity. It's St. Patrick's Day and everything else. But if you want to post comments to ask questions or answer, because often we have questions. We'll bring up topic like, well, I wonder if such and such. And we'll ask you, the viewer, if you have any ideas what the answer might be. And so you can post the answers in any of these chat occasions. So you have a plethora of methods of communication. So we were just about to go ahead and start to go over last month's notes.
It says 2 are watching.
Okay, well, one of those is us.
Okay, so 1 is watching.
Greetings,
Yes.
fair stranger.
Hopefully it's Jeremiah or something like
Know,
that. So,
know thyself.
yes. So, Brian, if you'd be so kind
Yep.
as to read last
Absolutely.
month's notes.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. So these are the notes from the February meeting of the A.A. Tolkien Society. And just in case, I don't remember if Hawk mentioned this, but we meet on the 3rd Saturday of every month.
I thought it was the second.
It's,
I did mention it, but that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Hawk. Okay, so last meeting was on February the 17th.
Oh, it used to be.
And unfortunately, some of us were out of town, so it was only our friends Corey and Chris that were there at the meeting.
We had a lovely chat.
Yeah. So Chris shared a book review on the book was called John Ronald's Dragons by Carolyn McAllister, and which it was having to do with Farmer Giles of Ham, correct? And other dragons, I'm assuming. Stated that he was fearsome and unnerving. Was that referring to the Tolkien describing the dragon in Farmer Giles?
I think so.
Yeah. While dragons were a terrible thing, they could be tamed more like an armed armistice.
You're going after your other camera there, Hawk.
Pulling on some cords.
Okay.
Anyway, so then from there the discussion went on to dragons in C.S. Lewis. For example, in the book of Be the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace turns into a dragon. Where did Lewis get that from? The quote was, "Kept them from sneaking past them. Dragons fearsome and rarely good. I've never met a dragon that didn't hoard gold." Beowulf, a comment on Beowulf, gold has a negative spiritual storage. My precious.
Yes.
So you had a discussion about that.
Well, right, because there was some kind of taint to the gold in
Yep.
Beowulf.
Right. So the idea of tainted treasure, a shadow of the storehouse of gold, and then talking about Eastern dragons, a lot of dragons that we see. You mentioned Pete's dragon, live-action remake. Fuzzy looks more like an Asian dragon, bearded face, or a lion with a long neck and a tail.
And I finally watched that last month. So
Oh, okay.
I prefer to pretend that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
What?
What?
The
I
reboot
liked
of Pete's
the-
Dragon?
I thought the reimagined Pete's Dragon was pretty good.
It was okay
I mean,
for a Disney film.
Just lower the bar there.
Well, I think certainly going back to various kinds of dragons, we see the idea, like, well, for example, if you see movies such as The Never-Ending Story, you've got the Luck Dragon, which is it's an Asian dragon, or I should say a Chinese dragon specifically, but.
The Luck Virus.
Yep. Okay, so
No, a Chinese dragon is more of a serpent shape.
okay. So daughter enamored. So this is your daughter, I'm assuming, right, Chris? Your daughter enamored by the magician's nephew while you're reading it to her.
Yes.
A horse turned into a winged beast,
Yep.
and the BBC version is wonderful. I'm assuming you mean the.
Yep.
Is that the BBC radio version?
The BBC.
Oh, Tyler Rawlings says hello.
Yay,
From
welcome.
Bend, Oregon. Oh yeah.
Maya Govanen.
Is someone familiar?
No, he's just on YouTube.
Okay, Tolkien. So you talked about how Tolkien, or actually about children reading fantasy versus adults reading fantasy. Children have flat readings, beasts interacting with each other. Evil is shallow, but good is also shallow. Adults read at a deeper level of good versus evil, and the beasts run in the background. Tolkien doesn't explain a lot of things. There's a lot of details that are intentionally left up to the imagination. A barter society. What did the elves give in trade for beer?
I think that's what.
The embodiment of. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that was his comment. What did they give in trade for beer?
Yes.
Happy St. Patty's Day, by the way.
Crowns of flowers, perhaps.
Embodiment of deeper things. Money is a distraction from the story theme, so that's probably why he didn't get into the currency very much. Which then, of course, for role players, they had to figure that all out. Was Gene Roddenberry, I think, influenced by that concept of no money?
Right.
Yes.
Get to a societal advancement of gold being worthless. Deep Space Nine, gold was worthless.
Gold press Latinum.
But Gold Plus Latinum was a different
Well,
story.
yeah, because it had Latinum in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
The lobes for business.
Wait a minute, is that a gold coin that speaks Latin?
Oh no!
Gosh.
I think that. Never mind. Okay.
Okay.
I almost got pulled into that vortex of puns. But anyway, so on with the notes. Wasn't Gene's idea copied from Babylon 5, apparently? Chesterton.
What?
Deep Space Nine.
We were talking about Deep Space Nine.
Oh, Deep Space Nine itself. Yeah, it was a blatant. They stole from his cards.
Copied.
Okay, sure.
Chesterton.
Reimagined, right?
Oh yeah.
That's the buzzword.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chesterton had different economics. The idea that everyone should be roughly equal. Stones in an archway. What was the stones in an archway mean?
It was his metaphor for how
Economics?
roughly equal people would create a pressure that would hold something up. So you know how the Roman archways were stones of pretty much the same size, and their pressure would hold them
Interesting.
up. And he always
Except
thought
for
that.
the keystone.
True, but there's a sense in which all the stones, if you take away the side stones, even the keystone will fall. So you guys were talking about that, and the idea of why do we have money? If we make something and freely give, then we have no need of money. And then a number of comments. Let's see here. The darkness in Tolkien's world is total control or enslavement of everything. The opposite is free men or free people under free kingdoms. A monarchy is a thing of the past. Tolkien had dim monarchies in his stories. The good king transcends situations. Aragorn has a faint echo or shadow of something greater, and it resounds in us because of our own past. Lore that Tolkien read has the same echo or shadow of something greater. Ghosts, the undead, having unfinished business. Tolkien put that also into his story. Boy, you covered a lot.
Well, we were discussing whether Ghost, the whole unfinished business. I've never been a fan of the whole unfinished business thing, but yet Tolkien uses it here.
So, well, the first example you mentioned was the Barrow Downs approach that the dead would have an influence. In this case, of course, whites. And then second, something non-Tolkien, and this is, I'm assuming, your comment, Chris, Japanese Shintoism, honor your parents even after death. Then that went to Terry Brooks. The lives that went before, unnatural river that the dead would come up and talk to them. Is this in Sword of Shannara or in Elfstones?
No. This was it's one of the Shannara books, but he's the last of the line of, and he becomes a wizard. He had his arm was broken off. He didn't have it, and he went and he absorbed all the druids that were in the
Last of the line of druids.
He absorbed all their energy, but it altered him. And what I was talking about is the way we read books.
Mm-hmm.
Other authors are kind of like that. We absorb them into our own personality sometimes.
We are what we read.
Yeah, we are what we read. That's what we were discussing at the time.
Okay. Black Elfstone magic to absorb the wisdom of the dead. When we read books by other people, it becomes a part of us. That's an interesting concept. Tolkien is giving what the best of humanity is like. Frodo is carrying a burden that we have to toss or to get rid of. We would like the world where the hero overcomes difficulty, but Frodo and Bilbo didn't. The lost cause wasn't because of Frodo, unable to accomplish his mission, but because of Gollum. The Darkest Hour review. So kind of segueing to Churchill, the movie Darkest Hour. Churchill chooses a different path, commits to a long battle. Tolkien is the same long, dark road. Our lives are not a bed of roses, but involve overcoming the challenges and the darkness. Peter Jackson, and this refers to something we were going to... I don't know if Wes and Stephanie, were you here in January? I think maybe you were. We'd kind of asked the question about do elves have beards or not?
Oh, certainly.
And then that kind of... We ended with kind of referring that down the road to look into it, and I think Hawk read the Michael Martinez essay on there's no proof that he could point to, so his point of view was no, elves, there's two issues, one is beards, one is the pointed ears, so the pointed ears thing, there's no reference to that, that's more of something that has grown in the imagination of people, but Tolkien never referenced it. However, some elves did have beards, notably Círdan the Shipwright, but we certainly don't hear of them often having beards. And so you, when you met last month, followed up with that. Peter Jackson exaggerated the racial features of the elves. Specific features, long blonde hair, no beards, all the same height, all the same uniform. The dwarfs were different hooded.
You sure it wasn't just long blonde for Orlando Bloom?
Next meeting, March 17th. So those are the end of the notes.
Yeah. Okay.
And as far as comments on the last piece there, I do think we have. Wasn't Figwit? You know who I'm talking about? The guy who's unnamed. That's the fans nicknamed him Figwit, but he was basically the dark-haired elf. I thought that was one in Rivendell. And wasn't he the one who helped you have Arwen, who's also dark-haired? So, but most of them were blonde, I think, in Jackson's movies.
Well, no, I think he did try to differentiate between the Sindarin, Sylvan, and Noldoran.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm. And so the Noldoran were more dark-haired.
Mm-hmm.
Sylvan, I think, were the blonde, typically.
And
then I forget, maybe Sindarin and Noldoran were both dark-haired.
But it kind of what I kind of brought up was that it felt like, you know how caricature drawings back in the old days of blacks, were, oh, he has a square nose and he has big lips, and that's the way I felt like Jackson had taken the whole Elvish thing. Is he said everybody was kind of approximately the same, and they just kind of blended in the background. There wasn't any variation. He kind of just, I mean, except for Elrond, who was kind of meant to stand out, there wasn't really much in the way of. I felt like he was trying to generalize all of elves and kind of.
Elrond is just an agent of the system.
Generalized rather than infantry-wise.
Oh boy.
So, well, I have a lot of gripes about Peter Jackson's representations, but that was when I thought, personally, that I liked his representation of the elves and such, the different branches of them. That's interesting. Yes, he tried to keep them softened and tried to emulate the glow and all of that consistently between all of them, which might have given a little bit of a homogeneity to it. But I thought he, in trying to represent that etherealness, Tolkien described it as a light, without literally making them glow. I thought, in a general sense, he at least was in the ballpark. I mean, that's a tricky one to.
It is a hard one.
But he did have a variety, I thought.
I mean, I guess in some ways the hair does show variety, but perhaps the fact that they're all bodybuild, they all tend to be taller, and that would be
taller
a
and thinner, and they should
Tolkien.
be. Yeah, Tolkien. Elves were tall. Yeah.
The Norse, or the Finnish, or whatever you want to call it, or by nature, if you look online, average height is a bit taller than the usual American.
Yeah.
Okay, and so there is some of that, but I still feel a little bit like, I don't know, I was still put off a bit by it. I mean, I understand what you're saying about the differentiation between the Sylvan, and I'm glad that he did that, but it still felt visually, it was really, unless the character had speaking lines and whatnot, there really wasn't, and I understand,
okay, that's interesting. I saw some expressions on this. What did you guys have to say on that?
Panel.
Yes. You're all part of the conversation.
Yes.
I was just commenting on the fact that there are 3 viewers now.
Woohoo!
Well, 2 viewers plus us.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah. Second person.
By Govanen. Did you have any thoughts about that, about the representation of the elves and such?
It's It's not a question I have ever really thought about much, honestly.
Okay.
Tolkien's races seem to be very different from human races, and I don't really know what else to say about that.
Okay.
Honestly.
Okay.
With the dwarves, I guess it's similar. Like, there's definitely variation, but they're all very clearly dwarves. Like, the elves are all very clearly elves.
Yeah.
And
Except
I
some
know
come
that-
from Scotland.
What was that?
Sorry,
Some
except
come
some come
fair
from
enough,
Scotland.
But at least with like the Weta Workshop people, they tried like very hard to make everyone unique, at least.
Yeah.
slightly.
Yeah, and certainly they did that in The Hobbit, even more so with the dwarves. With
Yeah.
those, they went, are maybe arguably a little overboard in the cartoonesqueness of it, but they definitely gave them much more distinctive appearances, even though they were all clearly dwarves.
Yeah.
Although Thorin, I think, was maybe the least dwarvish of them in some ways.
I think it's really difficult, isn't it, when you look at it? This goes back to what Wes was saying, that so he's inventing races that are. I mean, there's human, there's mankind or humanity. That
But even that has
represented-
many different branches.
Exactly,
that he
but I mean, so
defines.
you have already something which is different, or not a caricature, but perhaps we could say where you would differentiate these races in Middle Earth by kind of not formula, but characteristics that are exaggerated because of fantasy. And then if you then make a film based on a book that has these kind of races that are different from one another, it seems like it's going to even further kind of try to create distinctive features that are exaggerated for the sake of memory or whatever. And sometimes I think it's harder because it just doesn't match up to what our imagination might be.
Peter Jackson was also kind of tapping the collective subconscious for a lot of his
Sure.
imagery.
Well, like you've mentioned before, Hawk, Elric, I think. Is that Moorcock?
Yeah, it's Michael Moorcock. Yeah.
And is that I can't remember now. Is that Elvish in?
No, so
reference?
Elric, so it's the Stormbringer series. Elric Melniboné of the Melnibonéan, or actually, I forget what his actual name, but Elric of Melniboné was very tall and thin and an albino. And Moorcock kept writing about his weak blood and how and so that was just an aspect peculiar to Elric.
But that fascinates
was-
us sometimes, doesn't it? The people who are very
Very different, distinctly. He was all white. Since Moorcock wrote them as short stories, so there's a couple of different versions I've read of that whole series as he keeps adding to. So he did first the beginning of the series and the end of the series, and that was it. He introduces the character, he does the stuff, and then he kills the character. But in between was a huge gap of time, and so he's been inserting many, many stories over the decades. I mean, I recently went to try to get a replacement copy of the series, and he'd written a whole bunch more stories that in the 90s and 2000s I had no idea. But I found those actually harder to read because they were the short stories as the short stories. So every single time he needed to describe Elric, and every time it's his milky white skin, and he used the same adjectives to describe him over and over, which is fine if you're only reading the short stories occasionally, but if you're binge reading through, it starts to get redundant. Well, there was a version, when I was part of a book club back in the 80s, I don't remember which one, that they had put, then there were 6 or 8 stories. And they put them together into 2 books, and they had edited them as a novel. So he he took out the repetitive stuff, so it actually flowed a lot better. And that was the best experience I had of it. But that being said, yeah, he in the short stories points out how dramatically different Elric is, and that's part of the fascination of that character potentially. But. And then what we put in our heads, I mean, Moorcock really, really, really clearly defined what Elric looks like. So there's pretty consistent artistic renderings and representations of
It kind of reminds me of
Elric. But Tolkien was a little more vague.
Well, it kind of makes me think of the guy. I can't think of his name. I'm sorry. The guy who took a boat, went to China for the first time, and he
Marco
wrote,
Polo?
Yeah, Marco Polo is
Okay.
that the guy who wrote about it, and he sees all these people, and they're very different looking than he is because they're shorter, and and whatnot. And I'm just saying that, I mean, when you're in that society, obviously you can say, oh well, there were all these qualities, but then you have to be careful, because then it becomes, oh, is this just a novelty, and I'm just generalizing too much, about the people there, and not really delving deep into the people there. I'm just describing how different they are, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's the only problem I see. That
There's a term in social psychology for that, when somebody really stands out from the rest, and it's salience. And that's where you remember and may stereotype more somebody who stands out differently than the rest, whether they showed up dressed completely differently, they may have a completely different accent, or they have a very different appearance.
Like Americans in Europe, very arrogant and irritating.
So it's how much something or someone stands out. You notice them more, you attend to them more. Different variables in them can increase that experience, and so you mark their behavior. The person draws more attention. They're seen as having more immediate social influence, more blame or credit than might be deserved. And there might be more extreme evaluations of the person because they stand out more.
It's a dilemma in some ways, because I think on the one hand, in stories, the more that you can feel like there's much in common and you can identify with people, that's very it motivates you. And at the same time, if things were all the same, I mean, or you felt you identify with everything, then you wouldn't have that sense of otherness. And I think in fantasy, especially, that sense, that otherness is really, really critical for lifting you above your own experience and really imagining other people and other situations.
Tyler or any of the others watching on the stream, and by the way, that only shows who's watching straight through YouTube. It doesn't show the repeaters and everything else. Do you have any thoughts or comments on this? We welcome your comments. Just go ahead and post them there in the YouTube chat, and we'll gladly respond.
Like it says. Say something.
So yeah, so that I mean, in that the other challenge is, so what I like about Tolkien is he provides a pretty good amount of detail, but he also leaves some of the areas for your imagination to fill in.
So, protagonists and antagonists, does he leave more to the imagination with the enemy?
Well, it's mostly told from the hero's perspective. So we see the hero and his minions.
Beloved minions.
Yeah, I think you're right. The antagonists tend to be more abstract, don't they? They tend to be Sauron is shadow, or when he was Lord of Gifts, he just was very fair and tall or whatever. But he didn't go into a whole lot of detail.
Yeah.
Morgoth.
And
Gollum. He went in a lot of detail with Gollum.
That's true.
He did go in a lot of detail with Gollum. Is kind of in between. He's a little bit. He's kind of a mixture.
Yeah.
Fairly detailed with the orcs and the trolls.
Okay.
Especially some like Bill and the others were
But
moderately.
again, they're just tools of the enemy.
But he was always,
per se.
I mean, he did describe a little bit of the Valar, but being that Morgoth was a Valar, there was kind of a hiddenness to him, because he was, even though he did end up being stuck in one form at a certain point, because he was part of the land that he had. I think it's Martinez that explained that over time he lost the ability to
he invested so much of his energy into Middle Earth that he became trapped to it.
Right, and so in that sense,
and same thing with Sauron with the ring.
In that
such.
sense, he's a Valar, and so he may be, his form may be terrible, but in some ways, it's the reason why they're so vague with it is because, I mean, the Valar are kind of these invisible powers that really just take on form to.
Well, and the original point I was going to make was about so Tolkien versus I don't know who would be Robert Jordan or something. Robert Jordan's the other end where he goes into detail ad nauseum.
Robert Adams likes to explain to you why his evil men are evil, which kind of turns my stomach sometimes when reading some of the stuff he describes.
What does Robert Adams do?
He it's like he's trying to prove to you that the evil characters are evil, so he goes into great detail what they're doing. And it's kind of like, I don't really need to read this.
Kind of takes away a little bit from the
Is that
Was he-
subtlety.
Like, is he giving motivations, or what? What do you
He's
mean?
just telling you what they're doing, and it's up to
In
you
graphic detail about
in
their.
graphic detail,
Okay.
and it's up to
Well,
you to decide whether the slaughter of children is evil or not.
Right, I was going to compare Lovecraft to Stephen King. H.P. Lovecraft leaves a lot for your imagination to fill in the blanks. Stephen King gets in your face, and for me personally, I don't find Stephen King scary at all. He's so graphic. It doesn't leave. It's great for the movie scripts, right? It makes it easier. But Lovecraft gets to me every time because my brain fills in.
Tolkien's view on that was, remember, he was talking about a number of occasions in his book where there were times when they were going to use the enemy's devices against them, and Tolkien was like, "You spend too much time in the council of wicked men." They were using the Palantir. And it was actually warping their minds because they were trying to figure out what the motivation of the evil one was.
Well, and
Saruman.
that's something like a Nietzsche reference. He who fights with monsters must take care not to become a monster. If you look too long into the abyss, the
What
abyss
I'm
will say
saying
to
is
you.
that the motivations of the antagonists, I think Tolkien was saying the antagonists' motivations, if we delve too deeply in them, then we start becoming kind of partially responsible in some ways for
It was kind of a
what
variation
it's...
of power corrupts.
Right, but he didn't do with all of them, but he did for Morgoth and Sauron and Gollum go pretty deep on how they went down this path, choice by choice by choice, to where they ended up. He didn't go into heavy psychological explanation.
Well, they didn't explain the torturing of Gollum. They went out of his way to avoid any details of Gollum's torture.
No, but he did go back into Gollum's past and how he, initially had something was a little off with him, but he had the impulse control issues, etc.
It was magnified.
Yeah, and then the ring went, amplified and magnified that from there.
So, if I may,
please
move on. The next point, just wanted to bring up a couple things for discussion. One, just newsworthy on Tolkien Society, which is our parent. It's an organization that we belong to. The Tolkien Society's website has a news item that was posted in February. The Fellowship of the Ring soundtrack to be re-released on LP. I don't know if you've seen that, but so
On an actual disc.
yes. Well, you can read it up. I'll put it on
Yes,
put it
I'm
on
old enough
the
to
blog
remember these items.
for the notes. But it's basically Howard Shore's full score to the extended edition of Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. Will be released as a 4-disc set, including 3 CDs and 1 Blu-ray disc. The Blu-ray disc will feature the full soundtrack in various sound formats, including advanced resolution surround, Dolby Surround, and Dolby Stereo. So for sound geeks, yeah. So anyway, it's and it's going to be released on red vinyl for the first time as a 5 LP set.
Why is the vinyl red?
And I do still have record players.
I don't know. It's probably because it's
Have
Was it rhetorical?
2 record players
Giving you facts.
that I can actually play.
for your British members. You want to do this way.
Right, yes.
So
In fact, I've got a couple of old records up here.
nice. Okay, so and then also what we have to decide if we want to kind of cover today as well, aside from general discussion, is the
Actually, if you put it on the table, they can probably see.
Yeah. Well, I was letting them see.
Oh, details.
Yes. So the Silmarillion, read by Christopher Tolkien.
Oh, wow.
Songs and Poems of Middle-earth.
very nice.
Poems in English and Elvish from The Lord of the Rings and the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, read by J.R.R. Tolkien, sung by William Elvin with Donald Swann, directed by Howard Sackler.
He's got it over there.
I see nothing.
So it's just good. It's interesting to see, how various media you see different parts of that coming out. The Valar were mentioned earlier, and so one thing we had talked about possibly tackling this time would be Well, we mentioned Beards on Elvish Men and Dwarven Women, which we kind of touched on. Entwives, and then also the 3 themes of the creation of Arda that we talked about in January as we read. And I don't know, Andre, if you've read the Silmarillion, but we read the first section of the Silmarillion, which is the Anulindale, the creation epic. And then there's the second part, which is, I think, the is it the Valaquenta, I think.
Yes.
And we have not read that, but that gives more detail. Maybe in the future we could go back and read some of that on the Valar. But basically we were talking about this interesting 3 themes of the creation of art as they relate to the stories and the Valar's respective differences amongst each other. So that's something at some point we can tackle. Also consider starting to meeting with the Letters of Tolkien next time, as we've kind of walked away from that. But we have been in the past reading at least one of Tolkien's letters per meeting.
Yeah, we love to do that.
So we need to resume.
It was just because we were doing the reading
before,
that's all.
So when we do get back to that, we're at letter 146.
Okay, well, we should do that tonight.
And then also today, I'd like to, if I can, suggest just I pulled all of the references to Ireland and Irish in Tolkien's letters. And so we can read those off as well.
Because of St. Patty's Day.
Of course.
And you were bringing up about Northern Europe and stuff, so I'm half Finnish, half Irish.
Was Yeats? Was it Yeats? Who's the Irish poet?
Which half of you is Irish?
So ironically, the tall side. But the Finnish side, my dad's 6'2", but like all his brothers are like 5'7", and they're like short Finnish farmers. They're all up in the Upper Peninsula, Minnesota and such, and they're all short. And my dad was unusually tall for them at 6'2", but you know, my mom's side's all Irish. And her father was 6'4", her brother's 6'4", she has some cousins who are 6'6", I was 6'8". I say was because I've shrunk to 6'7" from injuries and stuff.
I was going to say something.
And so, funnily enough, the height comes from the Irish side rather than the Finnish side. So.
Ooh.
But we now know why, because of the Ivors thing potentially.
Yeah. Oh yes.
So about 1,000 years ago, County Mayo was invaded regularly by Vikings, including a group called the Ivars. This is partly thanks to Brian's research, which later, for those who stayed behind, became Ivors,
So
and that's my mom's side.
I have a question. Did the Vikings conquer the county of Mayo to get a corner on Maine?
Oh no!
I knew you were going to go there, Richard. I do it. I just do it. So anyway, so she was.
Let us move on.
So her background was from the Mars and the Ivors, and Mars it looks kind of like meager, but it's pronounced Mars.
Whip 'em into shape.
Where there's a whip.
There's a way.
Anyway, so it's a combination of the Ivors and the Mars, but the Ivors and Ivars. So it ends up looping back. So, come on, bring it back. Did you guys have any topics you wanted to cover today that had come up for you since the last meeting and such?
Well, I had some news to share. And
Please.
It's from the online school again, so the Signum University that I take classes at, and I do work study for them. And currently, I've been working on a course on a platform called OutSchool, which is mostly sort of appealing to homeschoolers, but it's for anyone who wants to take classes online, K-12. And so I've been doing classes about once a week on the Lord of the Rings, and this summer, so I've got through Fellowship and Two Towers at this point, and this summer we're going to be doing a free course on The Hobbit, and they call it Hobbit Camp. They did it, last year was the first year they did it, and then it sort of expanded this year into the OutSchool thing, and they're going to do it again this summer. The summer programs are free, and they're in participation with local libraries, so we're sending out information to all these libraries around and trying to see if they want to participate basically in these online discussions of classic literature. So there's The Hobbit is being offered again this year, and I'll be doing the lectures on that and the discussions on that, and that's in July for 2 weeks.
Wonderful.
Other classes that are being offered are one on Harry Potter, the Sorcerer's Stone, one on Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Magician's Nephew, and one on Wrinkle in Time.
Oh,
So
nice.
they're offering 4 this year, so they're
Wow.
really expanding. Yes, they're always.
Wow,
Yeah,
And,
it's
and
great
what do you
stuff.
search for to find this, or what's the
So
website?
there's a website, and it's signumacademy.org.
Signum.
Yeah, I might have
S-I-G-N-U-M.
that wrong. You might just want to Google it, honestly. So Google Signum Academy, and you can see what the URL is.
Okay.
But they've made a website. You can link to it from Signum University's website. So if you just search, as the kids say, search that up.
signumuniversity.org
Yeah,
/academy.
So there you go. So that's for the summer courses, and yeah.
Yep, there it is. Okay, so Signum, SIGNUM, university.org /academy.
Yeah,
Cool.
Thank you,
my
Hawk.
little,
So we'll include that in the notes on the website.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
that.
Wes. Great.
And I don't know if you knew that I had put some of my courses online. Did we talk about that in January?
I don't think we did.
So, this is the RPG research stuff, but it all overlaps because all the Tolkien-esque stuff we do. So I have 77 courses I've taught over the years related to RPG research, the research studies on the effects of all forms of role-playing games, tabletop, live-action, computer-based, and solo adventure books and modules. And I do it from the neuroscience perspective, psychology perspective, a therapeutic recreation perspective. And I've been teaching that at facilities and to professionals, and have mentored people over the last 14 years, and had increasing demand from people who are outside of the Northwest, right? I've got the mobile facilities, I try to teach, but more and more people from around the world have been asking, like, well, I can't make it out there. So finally, beginning in December, and the first class went live this January, I pushed some of the classes online. So I have 77 classes to convert to this online platform. I'm just using Moodle, which is just an open source platform. It's free. It's running on my own servers. It's not perfect, but I make the best of it. And so I've been doing that for the intro course, which is an RPG 99 course. And the course is $25, and you get 6 months access. And in order to move to the next chapter, you have to get 100% on the quizzes before you go to the next one, because it builds on knowledge. And the current students have said they've really enjoyed it. They said it's felt like a game in the way that it's kind of presented. I draw on cognitive neuropsychology for the learning processes to try to make it really stick a lot better. And then it builds from there. And this is also for people wanting to get certified. So I have students who are PhDs, psychiatrists, psychologists, master's level nurses in the UK, Canada, the East Coast, so far, taking the courses because they want to be able to bring in these kind of programs into their practice.
And they would be certified,
facilities.
Hawk, in specifically using recreational therapy, using
Well, not recreation
RPGs.
therapy, but using role-playing games. I do it from the recreation therapy perspective, but I also include neuroscience and psychology. They'll have to use whatever professional certifications they already have. But it does, over time, with enough classes, you can actually get, we've been working on these certifications as a role-playing game therapist, or role-playing game educator.
Standards.
Or role-playing game entertainer. Yeah. And it's just trying to set a bar of safety and excellence, and because there's nothing out there. There's no standards out there for how to use role-playing games in any environment. Entertainment, education, therapeutic, and so trying to do that. But that's... I'm going on a tangent there, but we do a lot of Tolkien-based. We have our program at Spark Central. We had both tables full yesterday. That went well. No Thank You Evil and Star Wars tables were both full, and there was a demand for a third table, but we didn't have a GM to run it, which was to run Middle-earth table. The kids love the Middle-earth setting. Having the shadow points and everything else to help with the behavior modification really is effective for these kids coming right off the street. They may be at-risk youth, and the rules help them realize consequences to actions and choose more productive options for their characters than they might come in. Well, the groups who come in want D&D, they generally just want to do hack and slash, and so for these types of groups, it's much better off doing a Tolkien setting. And Star Wars has a similar thing with the Force. Yeah. You've got the light side, dark side. And having those kinds of mechanics in the system makes a big difference in how they play the game. And they have a blast. They're a little disappointed at first that they can't just go complete chaos and murder hobo and kill everything. Some of them come in just wanting to do that. They're hoping for the that outlet.
I'm a fifth grade
But
teacher.
they end up having fun anyway.
I've been teaching American history, and to help them better understand the real choices that early Americans had in deciding what form of government they would have once they had gained their independence, I teach them in a basic form different forms of government. I'm saying, okay, so here they are.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, so let's make sure we understand. So there's rule by chieftain, there's monarchy. I teach them what anarchy is. They look at basically direct democracy, republic, and dictatorship and an oligarchy. And I say, okay, so here's all these different ones, what they mean. So now you're going to have a chance to think about what, in a Minecraft setting, because we have kind of a country that we're building. Now that you're independent, what form of government do you want to have? And it was really interesting how there was a vocal minority that really wanted to try anarchy, but it's very much from a looking at it through a lens of, it's going to be great, because then if nobody's telling us what to do, then everybody can just do their own thing.
But then you get bullied because there's nobody to stop them from
Exactly.
bullying you.
So we talk about the rule of law.
Are you familiar with EVE Online?
No.
Oh no, I've never played that.
I don't.
Oh my God.
So EVE Online is like World of Warcraft, things like that, except that there's no rules really. It's completely Darwinian. You show up in a space pod and get dominated brutally.
Their big pitch to new players is their promotional pitches are. They talk about the biggest scams that people have run on other players in the game, and how they got away with these millions and millions of ISK, and isn't it great? Until you're actually trying to earn.
But it's very Darwinian. It's brutal. It is not like World of Warcraft where things railroaded, and it's a persistent universe.
A player is the least trustworthy entity.
Yeah,
in that
it
game.
takes a lot to.
So
but anyway,
just connect. Yeah, I just wanted to connect back to what you were saying. That I think for kids especially who it's just great to have a heroic, say let's explore this. How can you work together with other people to save others?
And related to this, before we get fully back on track, so I'm hopefully going to be finished with my classes 3WU hopefully by the end of summer is what it's looking like. And so I've talked to Professor for my capstone doing my senior thesis on doing a controlled study on the efficacy or not of using role-playing games in an academic setting to teach a topic from the cognitive neuroscience perspective. So I wrote a paper 4 months ago, a semi-formal one that uses all the cognitive neuroscience buzzwords, about how you can enhance learning from the neuroscience perspective. And really originally it was a prompt on the test question, and then I liked that so much I went and wrote a separate essay on it, and then now it's turning into a full thesis. But several of the points is that elaboration and narrative and self-connection, all these things help enhance the learning process. You're more likely to remember something if you have all these other connections between them. And theoretically, role-playing gaming does all of that. And theoretically, wouldn't that help enhance the learning process? And there is some research out there already that shows for secondary language skills, yes, role-playing gaming seems to accelerate and improve because it's more immersive. And immersive learning for language is shown time and time again to be really effective. So for secondary language skills, there's multiple studies that support that. For certain specific topics, like breaking out in history, certain scenarios, like at this point in history, and role-playing through that, the kids connect, they remember it, and they're going to do really well on the test, as opposed to just reading a lecture from that particular part. However, and then there's Oosterkov Afterschool in the Netherlands, in Denmark, that teaches 2 years of high school through LARP, live action role playing. They teach 3 languages, English, German, and Danish, math, science, history, like all of it for 2 years through LARP. But they live there, and what they do is they start out and they say, we're gonna be a cruise ship, and they role play a LARP of that. Everybody gets roles, the captain and the crew and everything else.
Doing math by adding together fireballs.
Right. So, and those kids compared to their peers do really well on their exit scores and everything compared. So, but those are heavily modified environments. So my question is, if you tried to shoehorn in a role-playing game, like a teacher says, I only have this many hours to teach a topic,
Right. It doesn't
in the
work.
classic way where I do a lecture and you got to memorize by rote and whatever,
Right.
versus I try to gamify it, make it a role-playing game, and try to cover the same amount of content,
That's the struggle.
will that work or not?
Well,
and there hasn't been any research done
in
about it,
my-
so it may or may not.
In my anecdotal experience,
As
two or
opposed
three
to
people
anecdotal?
are paying attention and the rest are napping. You know.
That's the whole other but the question is apples to apples between just these two different, the variable is using a role-playing game approach versus this, but you have the same number of hours, you're in the same environment. Is it better or worse learning experience, short-term and long-term, than the classic approach? And I don't really know. My concern is in that narrow constraint, it's not going to be efficient enough. It takes a lot of time to do a role-playing game, and you have less control over the time.
We gotta
In
pull
the
back to Tolkien, I think.
cybersecurity world, it seems like tabletop exercises tend to allow for better outcomes.
Right,
So you do all this practice,
right.
and then
But
something real actually happens.
Yep.
And the people who are lectured to versus the people who actually do a tabletop exercise, the tabletop people
Right,
respond and recover
right.
much better.
So we'll bring it back to Tolkien,
Yes.
but I was very excited because that's starting April. I start my project for that.
Well,
So-
I teach the Civil War in April, and I'd love to use more role-playing in my class.
Maybe, and I was thinking maybe using history as a topic because I haven't figured out which topic. So I'll have to talk about that.
Yeah,
But
you will.
anyway, okay.
References to Ireland and Irish in Tolkien's letters. Letter number 19, 1937. Footnote, Tolkien lunched with his publisher Unwin in London and told him about a number of his writings which already existed in manuscript, the series of Father Christmas letters, which he addressed to his children each Christmas since 1920, various short tales and poems, and the Silmarillion. Following this meeting, he handed to Alan and Unwin the Quintus Silmarillion, a prose formulation of the latter book, which I believe was his only copy, together with the long unfinished poem, this should be the something, Baron and Luthien. These were shown to one of the firm's outside readers, Edward Crankshaw, who reported unfavorably on the poem, but praised the prose narrative for its brevity and dignity, though he said he disliked its eye-splitting Celtic names. His report continued, it has something of that mad, bright-eyed beauty that perplexes all Anglo-Saxons in the face of Celtic art. These comments were passed on to Tolkien.
Wow, that must have got his goat.
Oh, yeah. His herd of goats. Needless to say, they are not Celtic. Neither are the tales. I do know Celtic things, many in their original languages, Irish and Welsh, and feel for them a certain distaste, largely for their fundamental unreason. They have bright color, but are like a broken stained glass window reassembled without design. They are in fact mad, as your reader says, but I don't believe I am. Still, I am very grateful for his words, and particularly encouraged that the style is good for the purpose and even gets over the nomenclature.
Well, that might be debated.
Letter 122 in 1949, 12 years later. I know Icelandic pretty well, as I should, and a little Welsh, but in spite of efforts I have always been rather heavily defeated by Old Irish, or indeed its modern descendants. The mix-up was politically and culturally great and complex, but it left very little linguistic trace on Icelandic, save in the borrowing of certain names, notably Brian and Njal, which became used in Iceland. And this, of course, is through the Viking connection. On Irish, the influence was more considerable, but in any case, names that were at all similar in sound tended to be equated or confused. Letter 126, he mentions returning from Ireland on a trip. Letter 145, in 1954, he said, one of them is that I am particularly anxious that Volume 1 should be in public existence before I arrive in Dublin to take the degree of D.Lit, Doctor of Literature, on July 20 at the centenary celebrations. He's talking about, I think, the very first book of the Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship. He wants this volume to be in public existence before he goes to Dublin. Though the Irish have not much money for such expensive books, you might get Dublin to take a copy or two on the strength of the celebrations. Remember, at this point, they were talking about the inordinate cost that it would, after the war, to publish the books, and pretty high cost. Letter 148, again, he was traveling to Ireland in September 1954. after having gotten the degree of Doctor of Literature. Letter 165. I am very untravelled, though I know Wales and have often been in Scotland, never north of the Tay River, and know something of France, Belgium, and Ireland. I have spent a good deal of time in Ireland, and am since last July actually a Doctor of Literature at University College Dublin. But be it noted, I first set foot in Eire in 1949 after The Lord of the Rings was finished, and find both Gaelic and the air of Ireland wholly alien, though the latter, the air of Ireland, not the language, is attractive.
Arab Island.
Land of
The
Ever.
scenery, yeah. He liked the land, the culture, but he didn't like the language.
You like the
I'm
Green
trying
Island.
to figure out why he's calling it Arab.
Oh, he didn't say Arab.
Error.
Oh,
Area.
Eire.
Oh,
E-I-R-E. Eire.
I'm just about.
Land of Ever.
There you go. Letter 211 went to Ireland on official business in 1958. Letter 213, quote, I love Wales, what is left of it, when mines and the even more ghastly seaside resorts have done their worst, and especially the Welsh, and I especially love the Welsh language, but I have not in fact been in Wales for a long time, except for crossing on the way to Ireland. I go frequently to Ireland, being fond of it and most of its people, but the Irish language I find wholly unattractive. Letter 220.
Sorry.
Just casually slipping the
Yeah.
knife between the ribs.
Yeah.
Well, he's a philologist, so yeah.
So it probably frustrates him too much, partly because there isn't a whole lot
Exactly.
he can't reference.
And
It's
if he didn't master it, he probably, it's a little bit of
kinda
sour grapes.
frustrating, yeah.
Yes.
1959, I decided to get off the treadmill and resign from my appointment in Ireland before I returned as an examiner to the National University. I shall, if I get a chance, turn back to the matter of the Red Book and Allied histories soon. Letter 261, in 1964, his comment to someone. C.S. Lewis, of course, had some oddities and could sometimes be irritating. He was, after all, and remained an Irishman of Ulster. Which, by the way,
Yeah.
it's the Northern Irish he's referring to.
Yes.
The Protestant Irish in the north.
Yes.
But he did
Still.
he did nothing for effect. He was not a professional clown, but a natural one when a clown at all. He was generous-minded, on guard against all prejudices, though a few were too deep-rooted in his native background to be observed by him. This letter is actually really well worth reading, letter 261, because he goes on quite a bit.
I know.
Okay. Never mind.
He goes on quite a bit and says a number of other really nice things about C.S. Lewis. But Lewis, of course, was a Protestant, and Tolkien was a Catholic, and that was one of the areas of friction for them as friends. Letter 276, I love this one, from 1965. Letter 276, to Mr. Dick Plotz, Thane of the Tolkien Society of America, to the TSA first communique from the member for Longbottom, which of course is Tolkien himself. Dear Mr. Plotz, I have been away in Ireland and have just received your letter amid a mountain of mail on my return. I am much interested to hear of the formation of the Tolkien Society, and very grateful for the compliment. I do not, however, see how I can become a member of a society inspired by liking for my works, and devoted, I suppose, to study and criticism of them, as at least part of their activities. I should, however, be pleased to be associated with you in some informal capacity. I should, for instance, be willing to offer any advice that you wish to seek or provide information not yet in print.
Conflict of interest.
So he was away in Ireland. So he did seem to enjoy traveling to Ireland.
Well, it's probably very pretty there.
It is
in
very
terms-
pretty and less mechanized than Britain, which is something that Tolkien felt very strongly about. That
Yes.
the
So it's
countryside.
okay for him to go over there, but he doesn't want to learn the language. I understand how that is, right?
Yeah. Letter 297, the last one. This is in reference to a letter that he's a bit sharp with, but there's somebody who's basically saying, well, does this element in this language refer to this? And it's basically the idea that people recognize Anglo-Saxon influence on some of, especially the Rohirrim. So then they tried to find Anglo-Saxon roots for all of his languages, and he was really peeved off at this. So, but I
He's
won't.
studied many languages.
Yes, well, and he referred right because Welsh and Finnish were both references to the Elvish languages. He kind of constructed, and Anglo-Saxon, of course, refers to more the.
Maybe they were trying to find trumped up charges for being a traitor to the English country.
Maybe.
Not enough Anglo-Saxon send in these
No,
words.
that's not possible. Trump wasn't president.
Okay,
Shush.
moving on. Okay, so let me read this. So one comment was they were asking, could you please supply the what is the etymology, or where did you get this word? So, nazg, as in Nazgul. Nazg, the word for ring in the Black speech. This was devised to be as vocable as distinct in style and phonetic content from words of the same meaning in Elvish, or in other real languages that are most familiar, English, Latin, Greek, etc. Though actual congruences of form plus sense occur in unrelated real languages, and it is impossible in constructing imaginary languages from a limited number of component sounds to avoid such resemblances, if one tries to, I do not, it remains remarkable that nask is the word for ring in Gaelic Irish, whereas in Scottish it's usually written nasg, N-A-S-G. So nask is ring in Gaelic. It also fits well in meaning, since it also means, and probably originally meant, a bond, and can be used for an obligation. So you see the connection there with the word for ring in the Black speech.
The ring race are
Connected
obligated to the rings that they were given.
Exactly, to their maker. Nonetheless, I only became aware of its existence recently in looking for something in a Gaelic dictionary. So he must not have, been completely prejudiced against Gaelic.
Mostly.
Well, he says, I have no liking at all for Gaelic from Old Irish downwards as a language, but it is, of course, of great historical and philological interest. And I have at various times studied it, with, alas, very little success.
That's why.
That's why.
Because it confounded him.
Exactly. It is thus probable.
Ticking him off.
It is thus probable that Nazg is actually derived from Irish Gaelic, and this short, hard, and clearly vocable word sticking out from what seems to me, he's describing himself as an unloving alien, a mushy language, became lodged in some corner of my linguistic memory.
Mushy language, because it doesn't have.
It's the consistency.
Rules.
That's it. I think he's looking for the rules.
It's so localized.
Frustrating.
So subconsciously
you can't nail
he
it
took
down.
Gaelic Irish and made it the
Black
language
speech?
of evil.
Well, it's like
And that's our St. Patrick's Day special for that. Top of the afternoon.
it's like Victor Hugo going on and on and on in the unabridged versions about vulgar French.
Yes.
Which was
And
becoming
the political
because
systems.
it didn't follow the rules.
Oh.
And everything else was all over the local patois. Really, just Hugo would just go on and on for pages about the bastardization of the French language, and it's not following the rules and everything else. It's just-
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it came from any racist impulse, but I think it was that he just disliked it in the sense that
and he couldn't nail it down.
you could nail down. It just didn't have that. He loved inherent consistency. This is what made him a great author, because he tried to create a world
Structure.
with structure and inherent consistency. But obviously, he could make him a little intolerant.
So that's our
It's
take.
kind of
on it.
like
What do you
trying to
guys
figure
think?
out.
I mean,
It's kind of like
hearing
trying to
those
figure out
words.
Chinese writing system.
What about the Black speech?
Well, and
connection
Tolkien's
to-
take on Irish and Gaelic and,
Yeah.
and all of that. I mean, we're supposing that that's why he has that response, but you could have a completely different take on it. I'm curious.
No, that's what occurred to me too. It's sort of ironic that he takes that word, makes it the word for ring in Mordor, and then realizes that it's actually the word for ring and maybe bond, which is super important word for him in an existing historical language that he doesn't particularly like. I find that that's a really funny little rabbit hole to go down.
That which you resist persists.
Yeah,
Do you have any thoughts or comments? Or?
In terms of Tolkien, was he born in South Africa?
Yes.
Bloemfontein.
Is there any way in which he refers to any form of African languages in his works at all?
Not aware of any. Closest is Jewish with the Dwarvish,
Yeah.
just as far as kind of heading south there a little bit. But
There's a really helpful letter, which we covered earlier.
he was like 6 or something.
Oh yeah, no, he was, and he speaks
And-
quite fondly of
And it was traumatic for him too.
Yes.
He does not remember it fondly. It's desert dry.
the people.
Spiders scared him.
Yeah.
Remember, that's where his phobia of spiders may
Yeah.
have coming from, some
But it,
conjecture.
but as far as being, more xenophobic or something like that, I think. I mean, I don't know if that's what you
and
meant.
it's where his father died.
See,
But
So
but
they were
yeah, I mean, clearly that was traumatic. But I think he does. There's other references where he talks about some of the people that he knew there and how kind they were to him. And
I'm not. I just think that he didn't have any connection enough to incorporate it.
absolutely, yeah, that makes sense.
So he wasn't there long enough for linguistically to
His
say.
wheelhouse was Northern and Western European languages, and I think maybe what vexed him most
because
of all.
I'm saying with
Right.
Greater Asian anything.
Sure, and
East Asian anything.
I would think that what vexed him more was maybe is the fact that just that he wanted very badly to master it, to understand the Gaelic, and
Right. Yeah,
and that's why. Whereas if it'd been like, well, Slavic, that's great, that's a legitimate language, but I'm not really that interested. Whereas here he wants to, but I think you've got the fragmentation of.
He wants to read it in the original tongue, and there's no consistency. So
Well, and some of that is what's left over, what survived.
Well, there was Slavic had a lot of political baggage in that era when he was growing up, so
It's true.
probably discouraged him from looking into it.
Yeah,
Sure.
he was not fond of Hitler or Stalin, that's for sure.
Well, and actually that full circle. So there's a great letter I was referring to where he, this is in the 1930s, late 1930s, and it was because of The Hobbit becoming popular, and there was a German
Tolkien.
publisher. They were like, "Hey, Tolkien."
Right, they tried to.
They said
claim
we
him.
wanted to publish it in German, and so
Right.
we'd like the rights to that. Could we work this out? But they wanted to know first of all whether he had any Jewish ancestry,
Right.
and he was very
He went off.
he went off on them.
Yeah, he's like, no, not a chance. It's like,
Well,
how
no.
dare you?
He was saying, I wish I did have
Right.
Jewish ancestry,
Right. Yeah,
because
yeah.
he was
But
saying,
how dare you?
yeah, how dare you?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was
Right.
pretty vehement in
Incensed, yeah.
his rejection of their the Arianism. So
Yep.
Well, that just shows.
So, and that may point to, even though he is a product of his times regarding roles of cultures, gender, etc., he definitely was trying to be outside of that.
Actually, Brian, that's
more
probably
extent than
fortunate
Spears.
that he had that reaction, because Germany at that time was trying to make up their own mythology to get away from the Christian influence.
Well, Wagner, I didn't.
Yeah.
I think he wrote a little bit about what Wagner was doing to
Certainly.
the same sources,
Yes.
the same German Edda.
I'm just speculating that if he
Yeah.
allowed that to happen, it probably would have gotten pulled into Nazism.
I think it would have been tainted,
When-
Richard. I think that's
Yeah.
a very, very good point. I certainly think that there would have been some kind of splash. There would have been perhaps some kind of, and I mean not just then, but even now, that people would have said, well, is there some kind of connection?
So are those all the references you could find?
Those
for
are all.
Irish Ireland?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Cool.
So if you had searched for a different language and found all those references, are there any other languages that he's so, I guess, bitter about?
Well, that's
Anything
what-
else that defeated him?
And that's what we were saying. Slavic. It's the Slavic
But,
languages, so
does
like
he
Czech,
have letters
Slovakian,
But,
and stuff
he
like that.
never said anything about Slavic, did he?
A little bit.
Did he?
Yeah, he wasn't real happy with one of the letters. You don't remember
Well, that's
that?
strange because
I don't remember.
that is pretty clear etymology.
Yeah.
Well,
We-
the point I
and
was
he
trying to
never
make earlier
figured
was
it out.
when he was growing up in Britain,
Right.
the political foundations of World War I were brewing, and a lot of it was that Russia spoke Slavic, and so they were saying anybody who speaks Slavic is a brother to us, and so you had all
That's
that.
still
I
going
just
on
don't
today.
remember reading any
Yeah.
of those comments.
You don't
Those-
remember
Interesting
that?
to-
I don't, but what I'd love to do
Certainly
is
talked about it.
maybe we can look those up and talk about it next
Excellent.
time, because
Yeah.
I think these are really good questions about,
Yeah.
well,
And
how did he, I mean, what about Africa? What about,
because we haven't researched that, so we don't know.
I'll put it down, yeah.
The only reason
So,
why
yeah,
it sticks in my mind is because we had been talking about, we were reading one of his letters, and we said something about the Slavic languages because he didn't like old English,
So
but he
let's-
connected
Let's
to.
try to find those references for next month so we can actually.
Yeah, if you want to
Well,
help with that, it would be
The
great.
political setup was
I
that
can't remember
what
Slavic
word it
was
is.
kind of associated with the
Right.
anarchists.
Can you find those specific references?
No,
so we
I'm
can-
making that up.
Okay. Yeah. So
So,
Just be honest.
if we,
thank you.
yeah, actually, that is Yeats.
Is it Yeats?
Yeah,
I thought
famous
that-
Irish poet.
Right.
I mean, that's one thing is that he was, despite everything else, keeping this in mind. I mean, he was asked to become an examiner at the University College in Dublin. So he was well respected as in literature and everything else. But yeah, I mean, it's also a difficult time politically because
Sure.
you have Ireland seeking its independence. Even
The IRA is
Yeah.
in full
sure.
bloom.
So anyway, but he certainly did most identify, and without any kind of harshness towards other cultures, but he certainly did identify with and want to promote. Well, that sounds difficult, but preserve English mythology, and when needed,
whatever that is.
well, and because a lot of it had been, in a sense, thrown away or lost.
Yeah.
So he wanted to give that with it.
So much that was identified in English was French or something else.
And so then how do you do that without making it into a Nazi type of nationalistic. He really did not like nationalism itself, but he believed in the local. He believed in the beauty of what's local.
He liked the distinctiveness of culture without it having to be dominant or exclusive of any other.
Very much so, and I think we see that in his writings. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, so as far as continuing on with other discussions, we can either read the next letter of Tolkien.
I would like to. Something I came across here because it just happened. The latest issue of Other Minds magazine, issue number 18, was just released.
Great.
So that's on omzine.org, omzine.org, or othermindsmagazine.com if you want to type it all out. So this is a magazine that I founded back in 2005 that is all Tolkien focused, but includes the gaming community. And what happens is when you're in a gaming setting, you start asking questions you wouldn't ask because of just logistics and practical issues. If you're in the game and you're creating expansions of the world and your characters and players want to do something, you start asking really basic questions that you probably wouldn't think about in a literary sense.
Your players don't want to follow the plot. They want to go into these other
that aside.
You're talking like the currency type of
Currency things, exchanges, what does exist and doesn't exist in that setting.
Well, the whole thing with the beard and the ears actually matters because if you have characters who...
Right, how do you describe them?
How do you describe them?
Detail, because you get very detailed. You have statistics and grand detail in a lot of the game systems.
And spreadsheets.
And some people have spreadsheets. Yes, they do indeed. So, and if you're the game master and you're describing a village that you've walked into, or a city, well, how big is a city? What's the governing? So what happened was this was an homage to the original Other Hands magazine, which was in the 90s, from 92 to 2001, which was similar, but it was focused on Merc, the North role playing. And so I rebooted in 05 with Other Minds magazine as an homage to Other Hands, and it's the same quote. Tolkien said, "I built something for other hands and minds to build upon," and so that's why we're both doing that. And but I wanted it that it was system agnostic, it'd be all systems inclusive, and that it doesn't have to be gaming only. You can put in any Tolkien-related material you want to put in there, because gamers can use that. Gamers suck up all this information to breathe the world into life. And so it's a great resource. There's a lot of scholarly stuff in this gaming magazine, but it always has to be Tolkien.
So what would be some things in this newest issue?
This latest issue, and we also have well-known artists have been given permission to use their artwork and such. And so the latest, I'm going to go ahead and go large with this so that the viewers can see it as I scroll through it.
My face is being erased from the window.
That's maybe
And while he's doing that,
yes,
last week in my cybersecurity reading, there was a slingshot router malware that existed in Africa for 6 years on Latvian routers. Yes. And the only definitive conclusion regarding this malware is that whoever designed the malicious code appears to have been a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien's
Okay.
They also had good grammar schools. Most of the debug messages found throughout the platform were written in perfect English. Kaspersky Lab writes, the references to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Gollum, and Smeagol could suggest the authors are fans of.
Yeah.
So
I worked a lot of
there's
tech
a
environments.
Gollum app, as part of this.
Funny.
Yes.
I've worked in a lot of tech environments where all the server names are all Tolkien-based
Yes.
derivatives. Also, it's falling out of my head. There was another point on that.
Well, it'll come back to you when it's too late to matter.
Yeah.
Yes. OMZ.
Oh, I was going to say Python, the language Python,
Yes.
programming language Python, is all Monty Python references.
Yes.
Oh,
So
really?
That's true.
your editing environment is idle, Eric Idle. It's filled with Monty Python references intentionally because they are big Monty Python fans. So they're programming geeks, so they're going to have geeky interests, if you will, overlap into it. There's many, but yeah, Tolkien I've seen show up for decades in tech environments,
And it still shows up.
yes, and now in the hacker environment. That's interesting. Okay, so we have artwork. Well, we've got a lot of different artwork this time. I have not seen all these people before. So we have artwork and maps from Sergio, and so other minds is from all over the world. So I got it going, and then Thomas Mowinski in Germany helped kind of keep it going. So he's the editor now and keeping it going. And it takes a while. Originally I had a vision of it as a quarterly zine. It's never worked. So it's 1 or 2 issues a year, but and he and I have a little bit of a disagreement because he packs them full because they're digital, and I wanted to be able to print these. So he has one issue that's like 300 pages, and I'm like, you realize that would have been like 4 issues we could have released. I mean, I'm so grateful Thomas kept this going. He is so busy. He is, I think, colonel level in the German military. He is an entomologist of diseases transported by insects and such.
Yeah, I
So
almost
they
met up with him in Berlin.
So they send him all over the world to go study outbreaks and bugs and what have you. So he's a doctor in that as well.
Yeah.
And he spoke at MerpCon 3 in 2007. I flew him out here, and because he did all these maps. He did as accurate as possible all the maps of the world as it changed each time it was remade. This massive project.
Arda?
All of Arda.
Yeah.
All of Arda. And, with all the info from the history of Middle-earth that was available then, because the old Mert maps were too far off after that. So, he's so much effort into this, and I'm so grateful to him. But he makes more work for himself because he puts everything into each issue that he has, rather than kind of, we could dole it out every quarter or every 6 months, and you'd have less work. You can have like 5 issues ready to go.
So he has a lot of artwork this time?
So I can't believe so. It's artwork and maps from Sergio Artigas, Onur Bakar, Matej Kadel, Jenny, and I'm sorry if I'm killing the pronunciation of these, Jenny Dolan, Olanda Fong Serdanas, Casper David Frederick, Daniel Govar, Jin Hardiaso, Pierre Jobert, I'm guessing, Liga Clavina, J. Lazarus, Turner Mohan, Thomas Mowinski himself, it's probably maps, Dan Pila, Vincent Pompedi, Jan Pospisil, Eri Suonpaa, Tuoliki, and Maciek Zagorski. And it looks like he's got somebody helping him with production, Christian Limbach. I don't know if I know him or not. So that's just some of the credits there. And so this cover art is the Temple of Justice. Mabin, the High Priest of the Temple of Justice, confers with Erebin Damoy, his most brilliant student, about the best strategy to approach the new and powerful war chief of newly formed clan Arelt in the Third Age, 1943, and in his time of high hopes that the age-old injustices will finally be repaid to the haughty Dunedain. Sitting by is Derna, the grandmother of Erebin, and not yet fully convinced that the path of action is wise, she ponders whether her passionate granddaughter is doing the right thing, but has found no answer yet. So I'm guessing those are Dunlendines.
Yeah, sounds like it.
From that description. Who's that? I don't know. Doesn't say which artist that is. Let's see.
While we're waiting, can I ask Andre? We've often asked each other, how much are you familiar with Tolkien, mostly from the books or from from like more movies, or kind of what's your connection?
I've read the trilogy once. Obviously, seen all the films. I've read The Hobbit. I've never read The Silmarillion. Yes, I know. Leave immediately.
No. We're welcome all levels.
I was just kidding.
Silmarillion's
Don't pay attention to Richard.
Richard is our
Nobody-
mascot.
Yeah, nobody pays attention to me.
Richard is our keyboard.
He's our foil.
So my aim here is to take a very passive role and to absorb a lot more than I vocalized.
Fair enough.
That's fine, and we welcome that. And now, how long have you been here in Spokane, and how long are you here for?
I've been here since August,
Okay.
and married to my wife, who's from Spokane, so
Mm.
she'll be here for at least 2 years.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
That's
Cool.
great.
Wonderful.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. I'm so glad to have you, and thank you for bringing along.
Absolutely.
How do you guys know each other?
Soccer.
Soccer.
Cool. Oh
Soccer
yeah.
parents or soccer
We just
coaching?
joined
I
a
mean,
team together.
Yeah.
We
oh,
play.
you're doing
Play,
soccer.
yeah.
Okay.
Beautiful game.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Football.
That's what it's called.
Football.
Beautiful game. Yeah, which the Americans are out of the World Cup, but we won't speak about that.
So Thomas goes into his editorial. Rogue goes over on inside
Go England.
information, a review of some game systems, Bree and Horse Lords of Rohan for the One Ring role playing game. Looks like some fan contributions from Merp from the Court of Ardor and the Book of Linsul and the Book of Linsul in more depth from Tom Davies. The Gloomweaver Awakened, it looks like it's a fan adventure by Paul Kirk, and Demographics of Dor, Wathui, and Dunland by Thomas Smerwinski. Thomas likes to do really analytical. He does demographic and economic and all. He goes into a lot of number crunching. He will figure out what population, what the environment will support for a population and resources and all. If you see, get as deep into the Warren as you want. So that's the latest issue. So that's at omzine.org, and it's freely available as PDF download. And he does a beautiful job. Oh, what's this? I need to fix that. That's the Middle Earth Radio ad. I need to fix that. That stream has been broken for a while because my server had a hard drive failure on the RAID array that I haven't had time to work on. So he's got it added there for Middle Earth Radio, and it's not running right now.
It's an update. Live update.
So, okay. Anyway, so that's there, so check it out. And again, it may be of interest to more than just gamers. And that's the 18th issue, and all 18 issues are freely available. So, there you go.
Thanks, Hawk. Anybody else have any Tolkien-related news or issue that they wanted to discuss?
I could put a plug for my short story.
Tolkien-related?
Tolkien-related.
Oh.
Now, you were saying, Hamden and Silmarillion, you have read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, or just seen the movies, or?
Yes, I've read Hobbit one.
Okay, and have you seen the movies as well?
Yeah.
So you've seen the Peter Jackson ones. Have you seen the older ones? And have you
I've seen an
Bakshi or any
animated
of those?
Hobbit film.
Franklin Bucks.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
We recently
We just
watched that.
watched it
It
the
was
other day.
great.
Oh.
Yeah, it's still, it's just, it was a childhood thing, but it's still, my boys enjoyed it.
So did my daughter.
Yeah,
Yes.
it
Which one are we
still
talking
holds
about?
up.
The Hobbit?
Rankin
It
Bass
really
Hobbit.
does.
Oh.
It's just, they got a kid version of it, but they did it well. The music and the artwork. And,
Well, it just goes to prove that you can get some things really wrong, like maybe his depiction of the elves. But what's the feel of it? Does he get the feel right?
resonates.
And it's really amazing, though, because as adults we tend to be like, "Oh my goodness,
So critical.
it's so bad." But because
Because we have more trouble with suspension of disbelief.
we really do. Whereas if you get the feel of something, the general tone right, and you can forgive a lot.
Yeah. Well, with Spark Central, the community center, the kids come in. They may be like this, glowering. What is this? I don't know what this is. This is 6-year-olds to 16-year-olds. But they'll give it a shot because that's what they have nothing else to do. That's what they're there for. And within half an hour, you see them smiling. Body language is open. They're leaning forward. They're focused on what's happening. And but what I notice is the 6 to 10-year-olds, 6 to 12-year-olds, they can get into that in like 5 to 15 minutes. The 10 to 14-year-olds, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And then as they get older, it takes closer to the 30 to 60-minute mark before that release, that suspension of disbelief, they allow that to happen, that they can just let themselves just enjoy the story for what it is rather than be critical of everything. So, yeah. So, coming from that, how old were you when you read, like, The Hobbit and such?
I would have been 20, now 26.
Okay. So you were not interested at a young age or anything?
Not particularly, no.
What about yourselves?
Oh, I think we've said this before.
Yeah, but
yeah. I read The Lord of the Rings before I read The Hobbit, and I didn't read The Lord of the Rings until the movies were coming out.
Yeah, inspired.
Yeah.
People were inspired by that. Is that true for yourself too? You're not
No,
Oh, he read it ages.
no, I'm
ages
disagreeing that that's the case.
Okay.
That's what I did. Yes.
No, I read the first version of The Hobbit I read was a version that has the pictures from that Rankin Bass movie in it. So my image of The Hobbit has always been
merged
those,
with that.
sort of those pictures. And
how old were you?
And I was a kid. I was in like 2nd or 3rd grade.
Yeah.
Reading that. So I couldn't really read it, but I could look at the pictures and sort of like read some of the words and kind of put it all together over time. Yeah.
Okay.
I had a record of the Rankin Bass.
Me too.
Version
Me too. I
of
loved it.
it.
I played that thing to death. And I think it was Houston. Who was it? Who played Gandalf?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Not Peter Houston. John Huston
Yes, John Huston.
was Gandalf, and so that's still Gandalf.
It sounds a little bit like Leonard Nimoy.
Actually, the one I always mix Houston up with is the German guy who was in the Dune 1984 movie. I can't remember his name either, but I always got the two mixed up. What? Yeah. What about? So when did you first read The Hobbit?
Me?
Yeah. Just do a quick little poll.
That is still in grade school.
Okay. All right.
Well, my mother wanted me involved in all things science fiction, so she got me started on. She said something about the riddles in the dark was such a big, important part of the book that she liked, and she never read it again. But man, she gave it to me, and it was like, yeah, it was. I had two different sets of images because I did have some of the Rankin and Bass images, and then there's a couple images in the. But it was pretty. I can't remember what the image was, but they had just the idea of being in the dark, talking to this monster essentially, and trying to wiggle your way out of being eaten is just kind of something. I wonder if kids think about that a lot. I can beat them by.
Is it tasty?
Come on, sure.
Now, you asked when did I first read it?
Or get exposed
Which
to
is
it.
not fair because it is my dad who is reading them to me at age 5.
Okay, it's,
Wow.
right. I read it to my kids when they were
And
5 or 6.
not just Tolkien, but Lord of the Rings.
Right. Yeah.
So, I'm going to spare my children and give them a couple more years before that.
Why do you say spare them?
Oh, just the nightmares of spiders. and
Oh,
such.
really? Really?
Um,
Interesting.
I never had that issue.
But then I think that I picked them up again in 6th grade.
Okay.
Yes, to read for myself.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so similar to some people here, my first acquaintance was in a Walden bookstore. I got the see, hear, and say whatever little record of The Hobbit, Rankin Bass. So I put the record, the little, would it be a 78 little record, and play it, and the little and then you turn the page, and yeah. So it was the voices from the movie,
Okay.
but it was a narrator who read through it.
Right.
So yeah, that was my first acquaintance with it, and then.
And how old were you about?
Oh, I was probably 6 or 7 at the time,
Okay.
I would guess. And then, but I had been influenced by other fantasy authors pretty early on, like Lewis. So I felt like I kind of, as it were, graduated onto, because they're not all the same. And I felt like Lewis accessed my imagination much earlier. But
Yes,
whereas I
and
feel
that's what I'm doing.
Whereas I feel like I was able to really enjoy The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in middle school and on into high school, where it just became richer and richer, layer upon layer.
Okay.
Well, what was interesting is, like he said, they had a what was it? Channel 7 had the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe cartoon, and at the time, so I was reading The Hobbit when I was younger, they read the Chronicles of Narnia. But the funny part is that I didn't know either one of those people were, that Tolkien and Lewis knew each other until after what, high school, maybe, like 20s, before I found out.
Until you get into a group like this and you
My,
start to get
my
all that
family,
trivia.
my family read the Narnia series out loud to us as we were
Okay.
children.
Cool.
I think just the world of Middle Earth. I mean, you talk about very, very kind of early, impressions and such, but it's music, it's song. I mean, right away in Rankin Bass, one thing it did very faithfully was it brought the sense of mystery and the sense of song and sense of like things that have been taken away and things that shall be reclaimed, and it's just very powerful. I think to kind of communicate that, even though you have no idea where this all is as a child. Exactly in this faraway world, but that's the beauty of it, I love detail now, but as a kid, I think I didn't need to. I think it was just it could carry you away without necessarily knowing all the
Your
corners.
imagination filled in the blanks.
Here be dragons, I mean, right? The edges of the map.
Be dragons.
Pete's Dragon.
Any other comments on that?
The point about the song, right? So watching it this time, it sort of struck us that the way it's presented, it's almost like Bilbo is literally falling under a spell as the dwarves sing their song there. I thought that was a really interesting read of the story, right? It's like they sing this song about the gold, and it sort of like captures his imagination, right?
Well, it awoke something Tookish in him.
Yeah. So you're presented with that view of Bilbo from like then going back and actually reading the book, like that seems like a pretty legitimate way to read it, and tells you something about like what magic means in Tolkien's world, right? What we mean by when we say magic or a spell or something. Yeah, I think they were really like keenly, and they use a lot of language straight from the book too. So it's
That has the ring of truth.
Yes, the ring.
classic.
Even Peter
Swords
Jackson
and a
used that
walking
line.
stick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was the one thing that was missing, I think, from Peter Jackson's The Hobbit was I had a hard... I mean, they did try to generate it, but because it was live action, it wasn't quite the same. They were trying to generate that sense of mystery that you're talking about, that he came under the spell of the song and so
I
forth.
thought it was the extra pale orc.
Anyway.
Over the top.
All right, so shall we go ahead and read a letter then?
Yeah, I think so. And then I was wondering if do we want to perhaps next month read the Valaquenta, the second section of the
Does
Silmarillion?
interest you?
I mean, I think that'd be interesting just to connect us back in, so we stay kind of connected to what
It's
Tolkien's
the
written.
second story of the Silmarillion. The first one is the Ainulindale, which is the Song of Creation, which the universe was created through song, music and song.
January.
That's what we did.
And then the Valaquenta is really kind of describing how these servants of Eru, which are like angels or gods.
Now, if I remember correctly, it gets very Greek biblical. It's a lot of name and begat and married to and.
It's not
Is
as
that
bad as the
one or
elves
is-
with Finarfin, Fingolfin.
Yeah.
No.
It's later, okay.
It's
I'm trying to
it's
remember.
longer than Ainulindale, but I think it's only about 20 pages or so.
So we'd want to break that up so we wouldn't get
Yeah.
the whole thing at time.
No. But it would
It's
be
good.
interesting to kind of look
Is
at
it the
this.
same size as that short note?
The letter.
Okay,
That's the other hand.
letter. You're talking about letter 138. Yeah,
Okay, so which letter?
we are 146. If anybody
Alright.
wants to read that, Corey, did you want to grab it? Did you want to read that one,
The
or
letter?
well, I just want to make sure other people get a chance
Oh,
to.
sure. I don't mind reading.
Letter 146.
I brought a different book. This
Oh, I
is
saw.
enough.
I saw the blue cover and I thought it was the letters.
No. I don't have a book of the letters. I brought the Silmarillion just in case.
You don't mind me.
146.
Called toilet paper.
you want me to read that, and then we'll go to the next one? Just pass it down. Okay. 146 from a letter to Allen and Unwin, 3rd of June, 1954. The production department had asked Tolkien to approve the design of the dust jacket for The Lord of the Rings. I wish that I could say that I approve of the proofs of the jacket herewith returned. I do not. I think they are very ugly indeed. But to be effective, I should have been given an opportunity of criticism at an earlier stage. What the jacket looks like is, I think, of much less importance now than issuing the book as soon as possible. And if I had had nothing to do with it, I should not much mind. But as the ring motif remains obviously mine, though made rather clumsier, I am likely to be suspected by the few who concern me of having planned the whole ... I tell you what I think, since I am asked, tasteless and depressing. But surely asking my opinion is a formality. I do not suppose that any of my criticisms could be met without serious delay. And this is in italics. I would rather have the things as they are than cause any more delay. But if this can be done without delay, back to normal font, I would like a different type for the title lettering, at least on the page the spine is passable.
Is he talking about the white background,
Which
the
one would it be?
green and pale
Do we have
lines?
a facsimile like?
This is for
This is the Fellowship, right? Is that
the
yeah.
dust jacket for the Lord of the Rings.
The very first volume.
Is he talking about that one that's just different pastel colors? Because I never liked that one either.
I get the Hobbit one, but I don't know that I have
Yeah, I have one.
Lord of the Rings version like that.
The 3-volume set. We'll have to pull that up, maybe.
Well, pull the Hobbit version you have. We could use that as a reference.
Really?
Well, I mean, isn't it the same style?
No.
I'm reading a book right now on writers and the way they act socially. They say something about how their social graces have become less because they isolate themselves to their writing. And for some reason, the joke is that if you want to get to know a writer, that doesn't. If you read, how does he put it? Reading a writer's work does not give you any idea of what it's like to meet the writer in person in some ways, because the writers have a tendency to be a little bit like Tolkien is right here, a little harsh with the way they talk about their own work, especially, yes.
We're talking dust jackets, yes?
Yes.
Not the actual
Yes, we're just talking the dust jacket.
Okay, because
Jackets of dust.
the like here's Lord of the Rings first edition, $45,000. The
Girl!
I have 2 of those.
Wait, I think.
What's your address?
Shall I add to basket? I don't know.
They left
One click.
They left the phone, but they took the
Holy
Tolkien
moly.
volumes.
Okay, so that's what he's talking about.
Oh,
That. Pass that around.
oh, okay. That.
That's not the one I'm thinking of.
Can you?
It's
I like that one.
But the question is it like did they change it,
Good
right?
question. I mean, nothing's wrong with that font. He can't complain about that
I
font.
know.
At least he got that changed, hopefully.
He just
He is physically capable.
The font would have been maybe easier to change. So theoretically, they could have changed it before it was published, like he hoped. At least the font.
might be easier to throw it up on the internet if
no, it's okay.
my phone doesn't time out. There we go.
Yes.
Waiting for
Wow,
stream
awkward
delay.
stuff. Yeah,
I get the idea.
Okay, good.
Oh, but we have to read letter 147.
Yeah, these are short letters, so we can get through several.
The
So,
jacket
Chri-
of the Lord of the Rings
Was altered.
by the publisher
In light of his
in light of
comments.
Tolkien's comments.
Now I want to see the old one.
Previous letter. It would be interesting to see what the
Yes.
yes.
Brian, do you want to read it, or Chris, do you want to?
Go ahead.
It was a great moment yesterday when I received the advanced copy of the Fellowship of the Ring. The book itself is very presentable indeed.
And there was much
Because-
rejoicing.
Because it's done. I think that the jacket is now much improved and is rather striking.
So that's
Oh.
probably
Ooh.
that's the improved one.
I liked the gray paper used. It is and much prefer it to the other colors. But the specimens of the jackets for 2 and 3 do bring home to me the point, which I had not fully appreciated, the need for differentiation. Since the same device is for economy to be used throughout, do they look too much alike? And choice of color is perhaps less important than distinction, but this could perhaps better be achieved by varying the color of the major lettering, title, and author in red. I do not really myself mind at all, and leave it to you.
That's a far cry different from the previous. So, and I think what we just saw was that version that he liked, closer to what he liked.
I'm trying to look at the whole thing here.
Right, because we don't really know what the original looked like, do we? We probably don't get to see
It was
that.
rejected.
Right, exactly.
So the coloring, I mean, this is what he does on the 3, so you can see the coloring is.
Oh yeah, they did change the font color. Yeah,
and black, and then I think it's
red in the next one,
and then black again maybe. Or is that blue, black, red, and black? They're old. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. I don't know if there's a whole lot to say on that one.
Not really, no.
Okay.
Okay.
Corey, do you want to read 148?
Okay. I don't have a copy.
Here, I can give you mine. Oh,
Just-
there we go.
Corey, just pull it out of thin air.
I would love to. 148. From a letter to Catherine Farrer, the first volume of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published on July 29th, 1954.
This is like a week later.
I'm afraid there are still a number of misprints in Volume 1. I included the one on page 166, but Nosturian's is deliberate and represents a final triumph over the high-handed printers. Gerald appears to have a highly educated pedant as a chief proofreader, and they started correcting my English without reference to me. Oh, I love this letter. I forget about this. Elfin to Elven.
Oh, yes.
Farther for further. Try to say for try and say, and so on.
Oh, yes.
I was put to the trouble of proving to him his own ignorance, as well as rebuking his impertinence.
The impertinence of trying to change it, yes. The impertinence of that.
Put your snorting over there.
Sorry. The trouble of proving to him his own ignorance. I want that on a t-shirt.
Sorry, I gotta back up. So, though I do not much care, I dug my toes in about Nosturians. I've always,
Nasturtians.
Nasturtians? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I have always said this. It seemed to be a natural Anglicanization that started soon after the Indian crest was naturalized from Peru, I think, in the 18th century. But it remains a minority usage. I prefer it because Nasturtium is...
Nasturtium.
Nasturtium. Yeah, it's got an M on the end.
Yeah.
Nasturtium.
Nasturtium? Isn't that nasturtium?
No. Nasturtium. And as it is, were bogusly botanical and falsely learned. I consulted the college gardener to this effect. What do you call these things, gardener? I call them trifolium, sir. But when you're just talking to Daunt, I say Nasturians, sir. Not Nasturium? No, sir, that's watercress. Boy, these are really important things in his life. Boy, you got to get the flower right. And seems to be the fact of botanical nomenclature. It has been and continues to be a crushingly I can't even say a word. Laborious year. So many things at once, each needing exclusive attention. They are clamoring for Gawain. Is that
Gawain.
Gawain the Green or something? It is repeated. It is being repeated next month, and I'm struggling to select from all the mass of private stuff about the languages, scripts, calendars, and the history of the Third Age. What may prove interesting to those who like that sort of thing, and will go into the space about 40 pages. Time runs on, for I have to go to Ireland again about mid-September, and then on to Belgium, and then it will be term.
Poor guy. Another Irish reference.
He liked the Green Isle.
He's such a hobbit. He dug his toes in about the name of a flower because that's what it is. And he's not going to let them just go and change it.
Is this a second letter where he complains about Elven and Elfin?
Yeah, I think it's not the only one.
Okay.
Yeah, he's had multiple because it keeps coming up. People keep bringing it up with him, and he's like, no.
He's like a professor of English at Oxford, so
yeah, he has single-handedly changed how we say elves versus elves and dwarfs versus dwarves, because he crusaded for that. I believe I'm not aware of anybody else crusading for that the way he did.
Well, he helped to write the Oxford English Dictionary too.
Yes, but that was just what Q and W. So
There were no elves involved in the making of
those chapters, those sections.
It was a sweatshop. It was a sweatshop.
There were no elves harmed in the making of. But yeah, and now we do generally accept that dwarves and elves, and that is more consistent. You don't say hoofs, you say hooves. He used many examples, and again, it's that structure and consistency. Like, no, this is the way it should be. This is contradictory. Come on. Even though the English language is riddled with inconsistencies because it borrows from so many sources.
When you get so educated in one direction, I think, especially since he was such a language guy, I think sometimes, like, the things that irritate him sometimes are like,
well,
the
language
normal
geek
person is like,
well, it's like
a big deal.
It's like, any geek about anything, could say, no, that's a Klingon bat'leth, not a Klingon sword, or whatever, just get knowledgeable in a very narrow domain.
As I am training my daughter, who is 6, to read, we are first teaching the rules and trying to use books that follow the rules.
Good luck with that.
That must be a very short list.
Before then teaching the exceptions.
Right. That's difficult with the English language.
list.
So many languages are so much easier than English because they do have much more
Yes,
consistency.
even Japanese is
Much more structured. Oh, way more. It has nice rules and yeah.
English
I don't know.
is 3 languages.
Do Americans speak English?
No, we
Just
speak
about.
American.
American English.
English is 3
Americans.
different languages glued together.
Many. Yes, it is. It's quite a few.
Okay,
Well,
who's
it
going
kind
to
of
read next
reminded
letter?
me. It kind of reminded me of a movie where they did a deal where they were talking to a bunch of guys who do font for a living, like, and they'll be driving down the road, and some place with a neon sign, and they'd be criticizing the font, how far apart the letters need to be, and how tall they need to be, and the kern, and you're just like, can you imagine living that life where every little word that comes up is some...
You'd be so awesome.
You'd be irritated by everybody's, like, they should have separated those letters more.
Did you say that would be so awesome?
Yes, it would be.
Okay.
Because if that's the only thing you have to argue about,
Oh,
and there
okay.
are bigger, deeper issues,
I'm not going to kill anybody over their
Then-
I don't know, these
ratio.
guys were coming close. They were like, I don't know, I'd
then
strangle
that's
the
the
guy.
height of a peaceful society.
Yay! See? World peace through,
Yes.
fonts.
Through pedantic fontism.
It is called the font of knowledge.
Yes. Okay, next letter.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze one more in. Maybe one of our
He handed it back.
Not it.
Not it.
Wes, come on, Wes. You want to read
The
148?
goose.
149.
We just want
The book.
What happened to the book?
He handed it back. Yeah, we'll give him like the 20-page one.
I handed it.
So
Beethoven.
148?
I think 9.
No,
We just read 148.
okay, so let's make sure it isn't the wrong one.
Yes.
It's a page. If you want, you can break it up into paragraphs.
Oh,
whatever.
Wes, yeah.
Unless you want to.
No, after you, Wes, after you.
But he
You,
speaks
you can
proper.
alternate.
torturing you?
You could do a paragraph and then
He
hand
speaks
it.
proper English, unlike us Americans.
Okay, carry on, please.
We're almost out of time, so.
9. From a letter to Rainer Unwin, 9th September 1954.
Finally.
It's on reviews of the Fellowship of the Ring that began to appear during August. That's in brackets. So, as for the reviews, they were a great deal better than I feared, and I think might have been better still if we had not quoted the Ariosto remark, or indeed got involved at all with the extraordinary animosity that CSL seems to excite in certain quarters. He warned me long ago that his support might do me as much harm as good. I did not take it seriously, though in any case I should not have wished other than to be associated with him, since only by his support and friendship did I ever struggle to the end of the labor. All the same, many commentators seem to have preferred lampooning his remarks or his review to reading the book. The unavoidable disadvantage of issuing in 3 parts has been shown in the, quote, shapelessness that several readers have found, since that is true if one volume is supposed to stand alone. Quote, trilogy, which is not really accurate, is partly to blame. There is too much, quote, hobbitry in volume 1 taken by itself, and several critics have obviously not got far beyond chapter 1. I must say that I was unfortunate in coming into the hands of the Telegraph
Daily.
during the absence of Betjeman. That's Walter Betjeman, right?
That's yes, I think so.
Yeah, he's like a critic or something. So my work is not in his line, but he at any rate is neither ignorant nor a gutter boy. Peter Green seems to be both. I do not know. Okay, here we go on Peter Green. I do not know him or of him, but he is so rude as to make one suspect malice. There's a footnote there, so maybe we need to look at that. Though actually I think, quote, the cold in his head, unquote, made it more convenient for him to use Edwin Muir in the Observer and Lambert in the Times, the S Times, with a slight hotting up of the above. I am most puzzled by the remarks on the style. I do not expect, and I did not expect, many to be amused by hobbits or interested in the general story and its modes, but the discrepancy in the judgments on the style, which one would have thought referable to standards independent of personal liking, are very odd. From laudatory quotation to, quote, boy's own paper, quote, which has no one style. I gather that you are not wholly dissatisfied, but there have been some very appreciative notices from CSL, who had the advantage of knowing the whole, though not usually in the high places. Cherryman in Truth and Howard Sprigg in Sea Life were pleasing to one's vanity, and also Cherryman's ending, that he would turn eagerly to the 2nd and 3rd volumes. May others feel the same. Fawcett in the M. Guardian was complimentary and brief, and I was specially interested by a long notice in the Oxford Times by the editor himself in being by one quite outside the ring, and he seemed to have enjoyed himself. He sent an interviewer up, but what he will churn out for the O-mail this week I do not know. Well, this letter is already inordinately long. In the midst of it, Professor Dardenne of Liège has agreed to harass me with philological work on which we are supposed to be engaged.
Lots of
You have to. I think we have to remember this was kind of a sea change in style from what had gone previously before. Don't you think?
What do you mean?
There wasn't really any kind of fiction that was comparable to what he was writing.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, if his fantasy was, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings fantasy was so different than
Right.
previous.
So that kind of
fantasy
fits in
and
why he
science
got
fiction.
that reaction.
Because it was so different.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It would be a shock.
So there's quotes here from those people he's citing,
Oh,
the
great.
critics. So Peter Green, the biographer of Kenneth Graham of Wind in the Willows,
Oh, wow.
wrote in the Daily Telegraph on 27th August 1954, quote, I presume it is meant to be taken seriously, and am apprehensive that I can find no really adequate reasons for doing so. And yet this shapeless work has an undeniable fascination, especially to a reviewer with a cold in his head. Edwin Muir wrote in the Observer,
That was a backhanded compliment.
Wow. This remarkable book makes its appearance at a disadvantage. Nothing but a great masterpiece could survive the bombardment of praise directed at it from the blurb. The Fellowship of the Ring is an extraordinary book. Yet for myself, I could not resist feeling a certain disappointment. Perhaps this was partly due to the style, which is quite unequal to the theme, but perhaps it was due more to a lack of the human discrimination and depth with which the subject demanded. J.W. Lambert wrote in the Sunday Times, "Whimsical drivel with a message? No, it sweeps along with a narrative and pictorial force which lifts it above that level. A book for bright children? Well, yes and no." A.E. Sherryman wrote in The Truth, "It is an amazing piece of work. He has added something, not only to the world's literature, but to its history." Howard Spring wrote in Country Life, "This is a work of art. It has invention, fancy, and imagination. It is a profound parable of man's everlasting struggle against evil." And Mr. Fawcett wrote, H. LaFawcett wrote in the Manchester Guardian, "Mr. Tolkien is one of those born storytellers who makes his readers as wide-eyed as children for more." The Oxford Times Review, signed C.H.H., described the book as extraordinary and often beautiful.
I like the often beautiful.
All right.
As opposed to occasionally.
Okay.
Very good.
Any final comments as we wrap up here? Since it's time.
We'll probably get to it later, but because it might be referenced in the letters, I haven't checked. But E.O. Wilson's review, famous review, "Ooh, those awful orcs," is always fun to refer to, and his criticism of Tolkien's works as well. Because, and I mean, I think obviously some people could disagree and have really good reasons for why they didn't think Tolkien maybe had written a good book.
There's still lots of people who do not like The Lord of the Rings.
But I mean, I think there's a difference between a review that is thoughtfully critical, as opposed to someone who just calls it like Wilson called it juvenile trash.
Whimsical drivel.
And he actually called all fantasy juvenile trash. So he kind of had a little bit of an axe to grind.
That's still a common thing. Still.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all for
Thank you for hosting.
So glad you could make it. Go ahead and, as things percolate, if you write down little notes of questions you might like to ask, or you can shoot them off, and anybody here online, to Tolkien Scholars at gmail.com, and that's with an S at the end, Tolkien Scholars, the plural, at gmail.com. You can always post on TolkienScholars.org website. You can tweet us at Tolkien Scholars, and of course, if you use Google+, it's the same emails. And also, of course, you join our Discord chat server if you want to continue the conversation there. Or we're on irc.merp.com in the Merp chat channel. We've got a couple of folks from Finland that are always hanging out there who are Tolkien fans. But thank you very much, and wherever you may be well, Namarie.